Sometimes traveling isn't all it's cracked up to be. In fact, I actually ended up getting into what I would probably call the scariest situation I'd ever been in throughout my entire life while I was spending the last week of my cross-country trip in Florida. I had managed to travel from Connecticut to Oregon and then back to Florida without any problems, so I figured that I could really relax and enjoy myself a bit since I was at the end of my trip. The last city that I stopped in before heading back home was Tampa, Florida. And on the first night there, I ended up finding a really nice seafood place on the boardwalk right along the ocean. That was when I started talking to a couple of guys who said that they were fishermen and actually caught most of what the restaurant was serving. We got to talking and I told them what I had just spent the summer doing, and eventually we started talking about work. I explained to them that I was in the financial department of a small company back in the town where I'm from. I also explained to them that I used to fish all the time, but sadly had never been deep sea fishing even though I've always wanted to go. Surprisingly enough, they actually invited me to go out with them the following morning and spend the day on the water. Now normally, I never accept an invitation like that from people that I didn't know, but if there was one thing that I thought I learned throughout my traveling, it was that sometimes you need to trust people to get the best out of your experiences in life. The following morning, I made sure to be up at 3 a.m. to meet the two fishermen out on the docks, and by the time I met up with them, the sun was just beginning to peek out over the horizon. We made our way out onto the water, and in less than an hour we couldn't even see the shore. We were surrounded by the open ocean, and for a while, I couldn't have been more ecstatic. However, after another hour or so of cruising, I ended up asking one of the men where we were going to be fishing and what sort of catches I should be expecting. But instead of giving me a direct answer, one of them just responded by saying, "You'll see," which made the other one chuckle a little bit. I decided not to ask any more questions, and instead, I began walking around the boat checking out any fishing gear that I came across, which was when I noticed an apparent lack of any. I looked over the side of the boat and realized that there weren't any other boats around us, and at that point, I started to get a really bad feeling in my gut. I turned to head back to the two fishermen, but was surprised to see one of them standing right behind me. Before I could say anything, he grabbed me by the collar and said, "Come on, we need to talk to you," before he dragged me across the boat. He threw me down in the seat right across from the fisherman captaining the boat, and right away they started talking about my job. Then the man controlling the boat started saying that it must have cost a lot of money for me to travel as I had. I knew that something was wrong, and I tried to explain to the man that my job didn't really pay that well, and I only had the money to travel because I saved up for like 5 years, but they didn't believe me. The man who had grabbed me earlier picked me up from my seat and then started patting me down before he took my wallet, my phone, and my watch. He asked me the PIN to my debit card, and I told him that I didn't know it. But he wasn't a very patient man, as he immediately stuck me square in the nose before asking me for the number again. This time I answered by giving him a fake 4-digit code. The man took a minute to write the code down and then continued to ask me questions about my finances before finally giving me one last bit of advice. I'll never forget the look in his eyes when he said, "If you do end up surviving this, remember that we know where you live, yeah?" He then showed me my ID to prove he had my address, and then grabbed me by the collar once again before dragging me to the side of the boat and then tossing me overboard. I scrambled to stay upright and find the surface as I tumbled into the water. I gasped for air as soon as my head breached the surface and watched the fisherman who just robbed me continue sailing away. The first few minutes in the water were the worst because I was trying to fight the immediate panic of not knowing where the land was and having no way of contacting anyone for help. As time passed, I was able to calm myself down, but every couple of minutes, every time I remembered the situation I was in, I couldn't help but freak out a bit. I floated there for hours as the sun rose and then crossed over the sky. At a point, I noticed that it was starting to head back down, and I knew that if I wasn't seen by a ship before dusk, there was little to no chance of anyone finding me that night. Thankfully, as I was just about to give up hope, I noticed a shimmer in the distance that turned out to be a different fishing boat heading back to shore. I began flailing my bright yellow shirt around in hopes of them being able to see it, and to my surprise, they began heading right toward me. It was a 1 in a million chance, but I couldn't have been more grateful when the boat managed to pick me up. They brought me back to shore and I immediately went to the police station. After reporting the incident, they told me that they would let me know if they turned up anything and then call my sister, who was gracious enough to drive to Florida to pick me up. When I was 24 years old, I went on a solo road trip from Arkansas to Canada. Traveling from the southern United States all through the northern states and then into the beautiful country of Canada is something that I will gladly never forget. The way back is an entirely different story though, and I would give almost anything to forget the night of the trip when my tire popped. It started as I made my way out of Minnesota on my way to Arkansas. I was crossing state lines when I heard the sound that I had dreaded hearing on my entire trip, the sound of a tire popping. I was driving down one of the side roads that ran separately from the highway when I heard the booming sound of the tire popping and slowly pulled off to the side of the road. I sat in the driver's seat lamenting my situation as I remembered that I didn't have a spare tire to quickly swap it out for. I looked at the clock in my car and saw that even though it was dark, it was only 7:25 p.m., and I decided that it was still early enough for me to ask for help. You see, this was around 2001 when not everyone had a cell phone yet, and I was one of the few who didn't have one. This meant that I had to figure out how to get help the old-fashioned way by knocking on someone's door. I got out of my car and looked down the road ahead of me and then behind me, and I noticed what looked like a gravel driveway down the street in the direction I was coming from. I made sure that the car was locked and then began walking in the grass that lined the side of the road as I made my way over to the driveway that I had seen. As I got closer to the entrance, I just hoped and prayed that someone was home, and to my joyous surprise, I could see a house far down at the end of the driveway with a light on in the front window. I started making my way down the driveway, but almost as soon as I stepped on the property, something in the back of my head was telling me to turn back. I tried to shake the feeling off as I continued up the driveway, but I couldn't help but look into the dark woods around me that sat on both sides of the path. Even though I couldn't see anything, it was like I knew that there was something out there. I decided to pick up the pace a little bit as I got more and more on edge, and I quickly made my way to the front porch of the home and then up the stairs. I knocked on the door and then took a step back, hoping that someone would come to the door, but no one did. After a minute, I knocked again, but this time my knock was followed by the sound of leaves crunching to my left. I looked over toward the woods where the noise came from as I waited and hoped for the front door to open, but it never did. I kept looking in the direction of the noise, and through the darkness I could swear that I saw someone standing. I took a step back as my eyes tried to adjust to see the figure standing in the trees better, but I couldn't see a thing. My breathing grew heavy as I tried to calm myself down, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore and ended up heading back to my car. I kept looking over my shoulder with each step that I took, but I couldn't see anything. I made my way out onto the road and then back to my car as fast as I could, and once I was safely inside, I made sure to lock the door and turn the lights on so that I could see better. I sat there anxiously watching the rearview mirror, wondering if I was going to see what had been following me before, and to my horror, I saw it. Standing about 20 feet away from the car, illuminated by the brake lights, I saw the shadow of what looked like a man that was walking toward me. I began to panic as I tried to consider if I should drive and potentially ruin the rim of the car or not, but thankfully, I didn't have to. As I tried to figure out what to do, I looked back into the rearview mirror, but was blinded by a pair of headlights that were coming down the road. To my surprise, the other car stopped about 10 feet ahead of me and leaned out of their window asking if I needed any help. I asked them if they saw anyone standing behind my car, and they sort of looked at me like I was crazy, but then they told me that they didn't see anything. I ended up explaining my situation to them, and they were nice enough to sell me the spare tire that they had in their car for $20. They even held a flashlight for me as I changed the tire. Needless to say though, despite the amazing hospitality from that stranger, as soon as I was able to drive away from that area, I did. My friends always used to make fun of me because I was what they called a cheap traveler, mainly because I preferred to stay at motels rather than hotels. They used to tell me things like, it's not safe for a girl to stay in motel rooms by herself, but I just found them to be less expensive for basically the same amenities. However, I did eventually learn that sometimes when you're traveling, it's better to spend a little extra money on a hotel just for safety purposes alone. You see, I was on my way back to Texas after visiting some family in New York, and I decided to drive, so I knew that I had a long trip ahead of me. On the first night of the drive, I ended up staying at a Red Roof Inn that was located in Kentucky. My first night at the motel wasn't bad at all. I got in about 8:50 and ended up taking a shower with surprisingly hot water and then passed out shortly after. The first bummer of that leg of my travels was when I woke up the next morning and saw that it had snowed a lot overnight and I wasn't going to be able to get on the road that day. The first thing that I did was head over to the front desk so that I could extend my stay for another night. As I made my way there, I saw a disheveled-looking man who appeared to be homeless. I remembered him as I was extending my stay, and before leaving the office area, I poured a cup of coffee and walked it out to him as I made my way back to my room. He thanked me, and then we had a brief conversation before I told him to have a nice day and went back to my room. As I sat in my room, I thought about his situation and about how cold it was outside, and I figured that I had saved up enough money on the trip that I could spring for another room. I went outside to find him to see if he would want me to get a room for him so he could get warm and stuff, but I couldn't find him. Over the next couple of hours, I kept looking outside for the man, but he was nowhere to be found, and eventually I stopped looking. As the day dragged on, the snow piling up on the roads wasn't getting any better. I looked at my phone and saw that there was a grocery store about 5 minutes away on foot, and I decided to take the walk to get something to eat for the night. I forgot how quickly it got dark during the winter though, because by the time I was on my way back to the Red Roof with a microwavable pizza, it was practically dark out. I made my way to my room, and when I unlocked the door, I noticed that there were dirty boot prints on the carpeted floor. I thought about it for a second, but eventually figured that they must have been there the whole time and I just didn't notice. I took my coat off and then went to put the pizza in the microwave when I heard a noise coming from the motel bathroom. I turned to face the bathroom and noticed the door was closed, which was strange because I was positive that I had left it open. I listened closely. My eyes grew wide as I heard what I was almost sure was the sound of someone breathing heavily. I took a step back and turned to walk out of my room into the office, but before I could make it to the door, I heard the click of the bathroom door opening. I turned and watched the door open, and I let out a loud scream as I saw the man who I had given a coffee to earlier that day. He started running across the room toward me, but I was already out of the door. The man followed me into the dark motel courtyard as I ran toward the office, and just as I was about 10 feet away from the door, he caught me. I felt the wind get knocked out of my lungs as I was tackled to the snow-covered ground. I tried to scream, but nothing would come out. That was when I heard him whisper in my ear that we were going to go back into my room quickly and quietly. My eyes began to water as I tried to figure out what I could do. That was when I heard the beautiful sound of the bells that indicated the front door of the office opening up. The man dropped me back down to the floor as we both heard someone yelling from the office for him to get off me. I looked up and saw a woman running over to me, and thankfully the man who was attacking me ran off. The woman brought me into the office, and we waited for the police together behind the locked door. The two officers escorted me to my room to gather my things because the manager was letting me change to a different room, and there were 2 more officers searching the area for the man who attacked me. I didn't really get any sleep that night, and as soon as the sun was up, I decided to hit the road. I checked out the motel, thanked the woman who helped me out the previous night, and as soon as I left the state, I never looked back. Hopefully, they ended up finding that man.